Sebastiano DiGaetano was born in 1862 in Castellammare del Golfo, Sicily. On October 24, 1898, he emigrated to the United States, eventually settling in Brooklyn, New York in the Williamsburg section in 1908. The Williamsburg section of Brooklyn was run by a crime family led by Paolo Orlando. Orlando was born in Campo Reale, as was his possible predecessor, Antonino Governale. In 1909, DiGaetano took over the position of boss of the Orlando family. This was due to the leader, Paolo Orlando, being deported back to Italy. As one of the bosses of the four New York families, he was a potential candidate for the position of boss of all bosses after Giuseppe Morello. The previous boss of bosses was convicted for counterfeiting alongside another New York crime boss, Ignazio Lupo. In 1910, he was officially named acting boss of bosses while Giuseppe Morello was going through the appeals process. During this time, he would use his position to give orders to members of the other families only when it was necessary. For example, in 1910, he advised the Morello family to temporarily stop selling their counterfeit bills because of an alleged informant in their organization. DiGaetano would hold the position of boss of bosses until 1912, when Morello's appeal failed. In 1912, he would officially resign as boss of his family and would be succeeded by Niccolo Schiro. The position of boss of bosses would officially go to Salvatore D'Aquila. D'Aquila had just been named boss of the former Lupo family. After stepping down, Sebastiano DiGaetano would disappear completely. It is likely that he left the US and returned to Italy, although it is unknown what ultimately happened to him. Vincent Mangano was born Vincenzo Giovanni Mangano in Palermo, Sicily on March 28, 1888. He was the middle child of Vincenzo and Serafina Mangano, having an older sister and a younger brother. His brother Philip was 10 years younger than him, being born in 1898. Mangano first arrived in the US in 1906. He would officially settle there in 1911, settling on Union Street in Brooklyn. By 1911, Salvatore D'Aquila was about to be named boss of the Ignazio Lupo family. This family largely controlled Brooklyn. In 1912, D'Aquila would officially be named as the boss of the family, as well as boss of all bosses. Vincenzo Mangano's rise in the criminal underworld is largely undocumented, as he was a very low-profile mobster. Allegedly, in the 1920s, he would take over the organization of Giuseppe Balsamo. Giuseppe Balsamo is considered the boss of Brooklyn, likely being a high-ranking member of the D'Aquila crime family. Mangano, alongside his brother Philip, would most likely get involved in the alcohol business. The 18th Amendment that was passed on January 17, 1920, would completely outlaw the sale of alcohol in the United States. This would make selling alcohol an incredibly lucrative business. In the early 1920s, an internal war would break out in the Morello crime family. The family was run by Salvador Loyalcano. Loyalcano was loyal to Salvatore D'Aquila and respected his position as boss of all bosses. In late 1920, Loyalcano would be gunned down by a hitman working under Giuseppe Morello. Morello wanted to take back control of his family. Initially, he asked Loyalcano to step down, however, he refused. The murder of Loyalcano led to Salvatore D'Aquila ordering the deaths of Giuseppe Morello and D'Aquila's former boss, Ignazio Lupo. However, Morello and Lupo would eventually get their death sentences relinquished. The Morello family would split into two factions after the war. The faction loyal to Salvatore D'Aquila was led by Gaetano Reina, and the faction loyal to Giuseppe Morello was led by Morello's half-brother Vincenzo Terranova. Not long after, in 1922, Vincenzo Terranova would be gunned down by D'Aquila family soldier Umberto Valenti. As a result of this, Giuseppe "Joe the Boss" Masseria would take his place as boss. Joe Masseria would appoint Giuseppe Morello to the position of underboss of the family. Together they would consolidate power over the 5 families in New York. Joe Masseria would present a significant threat to D'Aquila's power as boss of all bosses, eventually taking over the position in 1928 after having Salvatore D'Aquila assassinated. Joe Masseria would have some legendary mobsters working under him like Charles Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, and Frank Costello. The D'Aquila family would be taken over by Manfredi Mineo, who was D'Aquila's second in command. Mineo would be appointed by Joe Masseria. By 1930, the families became disillusioned with Joe Masseria's reign. At the time, the 5 families were the Profaci, Reina, Schiro, Mineo, and Masseria families. A high-ranking member of the Schiro family, Salvatore Maranzano, took over the position of boss after Niccolo Schiro stepped down. Maranzano was also interested in taking the position of boss of all bosses. Maranzano got the Reina family on side. The boss, Tommy Reina, would be murdered by Masseria hitmen as a result. This would spark a war between the Masseria and Maranzano families. This war would result in the deaths of Giuseppe Morello, Manfredi Mineo, and eventually Masseria, resulting in victory for Maranzano. When Maranzano rose to power, the former D'Aquila family would be taken over by Frank Scalise. Scalise was a Maranzano loyalist who was a high-ranking member in the Sicilian faction of the D'Aquila family. In September 1931, Maranzano ordered the deaths of Luciano, Genovese, Costello, and Mangano, tasking Scalise to have their deaths carried out. Scalise would fail to carry out the murders and flip to Luciano and Mangano's side. Scalise's information was corroborated by Tommy Lucchese. After Reina was killed during the war, his family was taken over by Tommaso Galliano. Galliano would appoint Gaetano Tommy Lucchese to the position of underboss. Lucchese was an old friend of Charlie Luciano. After the death of Masseria, the Galliano family became close to the Maranzano family. As a result, Tommy Lucchese, with the approval of Galliano, would warn Charlie Luciano about the impending hits. Charlie Luciano would act first, and on September 10th, Maranzano would be stabbed repeatedly and shot by Jewish hitmen provided by Louis Lepke Buchalter and Meyer Lansky. After Maranzano's death, Luciano would appoint Giuseppe Joe Bonanno to the position of boss of the Maranzano family. Frank Scalise would step down as the boss of the former D'Aquila family, and Luciano would appoint Mangano to the position of boss. Luciano would get rid of the position of boss of all bosses and organize the 5 New York families into a board of directors. When Mangano was appointed to the position of boss, Luciano would appoint his friend Albert Anastasia to the position of underboss. Mangano and Anastasia initially had a good working relationship, with Anastasia controlling the Brooklyn waterfront for Mangano. Albert Anastasia's close relationship with Charlie Luciano and Frank Costello would eventually worry Mangano. This, alongside Anastasia's willingness to work with other families without Mangano's consent, would put them at odds. In 1936, Charlie Luciano would be tried and convicted for compulsory prostitution and would be sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. This would result in the family being taken over by Vito Genovese. However, Genovese would flee to Italy to escape a murder charge in 1937, resulting in Frank Costello taking over. Prior to this, there was a meeting between the 5 families. They had met to discuss how they would handle the prosecutor, Thomas E. Dewey. During this meeting, Albert Anastasia would suggest killing Dewey. The other families were furiously opposed to doing this, as was Mangano. From this point, Mangano kept a very low profile as boss. Tensions would keep rising between Mangano and Anastasia. In 1946, Luciano was released from prison and deported to Italy. Around the same time, Vito Genovese would return from Italy and beat his murder charge. By 1951, Albert Anastasia would make a move on Vincent and Philip Mangano. On April 19th, they would both disappear. On the same day, Philip's body would be discovered in a field in Jamaica Bay in Brooklyn. Vincent Mangano, however, would remain missing. Even to this day, it is unclear where his body was disposed of.